Well, you find me today in the Brian Tabbert Memorial Garden. I've just been walking around Coggeshall looking at the timber frame buildings. Timber frame buildings like that over there, you can see. But Coggeshall's famous for its medieval look with the Paycocks building. I've just been looking at that as well, because there's something about these buildings that I wanted to talk about, which is the fact that they're timber framed and they're still around. They do require a lot of maintenance. They've stood the test of time. The construction of these buildings contains a lot of history. I'm not going to go and bore you with all the details. For a lot of this wood is hundreds of years old and it's still there. Voiceover Dave has something to tell you about wood, so I'll hand you over to him.
It is a profound and unsettling truth that left to its own devices, absolutely everything in the universe, from galaxies and star systems down to your average garden shed, will eventually attempt to achieve a state of maximum inconvenience. In the history of domestic architecture, few phenomena demonstrate this universal law quite so perfectly as the medieval wood frame building. These structures invariably look less like they were built by qualified carpenters and more like they were assembled by someone briefly glancing at the instructions while fleeing an angry swarm of bees. The modern eye, accustomed to laser levels and standardized 2x4s, naturally assumes the crookedness is just down to bad maintenance, or perhaps a foundational dislike of geometry on the part of the builder. But the primary culprit is far more insidious, far more organic. It is, of course, the green oak. Medieval builders, lacking the patience or the millennia required to properly season timber, would simply chop down an oak and immediately stick it into the frame. This wood was essentially still wet. In fact, it was so wet it was still sending text messages to its friends in the forest. Now, wet wood is full of water, and water eventually leaves. And when the water leaves the wood, it shrinks, and it shrinks unevenly. The building doesn't fall down. Oak is far more stubborn for that.
That's interesting about the frames and why the wood warps and why we've got so many wonky buildings. But tell us about the doors. There's a pattern on these doors, these little squares in the doors. They're significant. They're on all the older buildings, and they're even used today with the modern techniques. You find them on the moulded doors, for example, and if people look around their houses, they'll see that pattern. There's doors everywhere with that pattern. There's one across here with that pattern. Voiceover Dave, tell us about these panels, a little bit about that.
The history of woodwork is, tragically, the history of disappointment. For millennia, humanity, in its boundless optimism, failed to grasp one crucial, fundamental truth about wood. Wood expands. It expands with an enthusiasm usually reserved only for amateur accordion players, and it shrinks with the sullen petulance of a teenager asked to tidy their room. The early solutions were woefully inadequate. By the 16th century, the problem was critical. Doors were refusing to cooperate, and cabinets were routinely ejecting their contents onto the floor just to prove a point. The solution, as is usually the case in history, was simultaneously brilliant, obvious, and the result of extreme apathy. In 1537, a rather unremarkable Flemish joiner named Gerald was tasked with building a massive cabinet for a minor duke, who was particularly obsessed with storing vast quantities of slightly damp cheese. Gerald, having just lost a staring contest to a particularly fibrous piece of walnut, was thoroughly fed up. Instead of attempting to nail a solid, unyielding slab into its frame, a gesture the wood took as a personal affront, Gerald simply cut a smaller, thinner piece, shoved it into a groove carved along the inner edge, and retired for a well-deserved glass of lukewarm ale. He didn't nail it, he didn't glue it, he just left it there. And the wood, suddenly realizing it had 4 whole sides to expand into, rather than one massive side to push against, calmed down immediately. It thought, "Oh, space, right, carry on then." This, ladies and gentlemen, is the profound history of the frame and panel structure.
So that's wood and what it does to buildings, and why those doors are a little nod to the history of wood. Especially today, we see that pattern, that square pattern, in so many doors and on wall panels even. That's history. It's fascinating. It fascinates me. When you think that in 1870, around then in America, they started kiln drying wood, which is a process. It's a subject for another video. Anyway, if you enjoyed the video, please don't forget, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already subscribed, and I will see you in another video, so stay safe.